The man being dragged away in designer handcuffs had built his empire on the backs of single mothers, immigrants, and families just trying to survive. For years, Marcus Wellington thought his money and connections made him untouchable. He owned half the city's rental properties, had politicians in his pocket, and crushed anyone who dared challenge him. But what he didn't know was that one of his tenants, a woman he tried to destroy, had been quietly building a case that would bring down not just him, but an entire network of corruption that reached the highest levels of city government. I'm that woman. And this is the story of how I turned the tables on a man who thought he could ruin my life. Have you ever met someone who seemed so powerful that you thought they'd never face consequences? Well, stick around, because sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one who brings your whole world crashing down. My name is Maya Rodriguez, and 6 months ago, I thought I had finally caught a break. I'm a single mother working as a paralegal, barely scraping by after my ex stopped paying child support. When I found Marcus's listing for a luxury apartment in downtown, granite countertops, hardwood floors, the works, for only $800 a month, I should have known something was wrong. But when you're desperate and your 7-year-old daughter needs a stable home, you don't ask too many questions. Marcus Wellington was everything I wasn't. Third-generation real estate royalty, inherited a portfolio worth $20 million from his father. The golden boy of the city's property management scene. Clean-cut, charming, the kind of guy who shows up to charity galas and gets his picture in the newspaper. His father had built their empire on treating tenants with dignity. Marcus had other plans. See, Marcus had figured out something brilliant and evil. He would target families like mine, single mothers, recent immigrants, people with poor credit or past evictions. People who couldn't afford deposits at decent places. People who wouldn't fight back. He'd show us these gorgeous apartments, all staged and perfect. Then the moment we signed the lease, everything changed. The apartment I moved into looked nothing like the photos. The hardwood floors were water-damaged and warped. The granite countertops were cheap laminate peeling at the edges. But the real horror was hidden behind the walls, black mold creeping through the bathroom, faulty wiring that sparked when you turned on lights, heating that barely worked in winter. Within 2 weeks, Sophia's asthma attacks got so bad I was taking her to the emergency room twice a week. It looked amazing online, but in person, it was a nightmare. And I know some of you have been through the same. Now, here's what made Marcus truly evil. He had perfected the art of trapping us. The lease was written in legal language that basically said we had no rights. Any complaint was met with threats of immediate eviction. He'd collect our security deposits, usually first month, last month, plus deposit, so we're talking $2,000 up front, then make it impossible to ever get it back. He'd claim we damaged things that were already broken, charge us for cleaning fees that cost more than professional services, and if we tried to fight it, he'd threaten to put us on a tenant blacklist that would make it impossible to rent anywhere else in the city. The worst part? He wasn't just stealing from us, he was stealing our dignity. I watched this man look at my daughter coughing from the mold in our bathroom and tell me it was probably just allergies. I watched him collect rent for Maria, the woman next door who worked 3 jobs to support her elderly mother, while knowing her ceiling was about to collapse from a water leak he refused to fix. Marcus had turned housing into a weapon. And for 2 years, I thought there was nothing I could do about it. But sometimes, the person you underestimate the most is the one who's been quietly learning exactly how to destroy you. The first time I tried to complain about the mold, Marcus looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Maya, he said with that patronizing smile, I inspected that apartment personally before you moved in. There's no mold. Maybe you're not cleaning properly. When I showed him pictures of the black spots spreading across Sophia's bedroom wall, he shrugged. That's just normal wear and tear. You signed a lease accepting the property as is. That's when I realized Marcus had perfected the art of gaslighting. Every complaint was met with the same response. It was my fault, my imagination, my responsibility. When the heater broke in January and Sophia was getting sick from the cold, he told me I must have damaged it somehow. When I called about the electrical outlet sparking, he said I was probably using too many appliances. It was like arguing with a wall, except the wall held all the power. But the real nightmare started when I tried to organize the other tenants. I knocked on doors, talked to neighbors, and discovered something terrifying. We were all dealing with the same problems. Maria's ceiling had been leaking for 8 months. The family upstairs had been without hot water for 6 weeks. The elderly man at the end of the hall was paying rent for an apartment where the bathroom door wouldn't close. Every single one of us had the same story. We'd complain, Marcus would dismiss us, and if we pushed too hard, we'd get a letter threatening eviction for disturbing other tenants or violating lease terms. He had created a system where speaking up meant losing your home. While helping a neighbor move, I found a box of hidden building records, complaints, photos of dangerous conditions, even buried letters from the health department. Marcus wasn't just negligent. He had spent years covering up systemic abuse. This is where I got really angry. Someone with power was clearly wrong, and for a long time, I felt helpless. Maybe you felt that too. But Marcus wasn't done with me. When word got back to him that I was stirring up trouble, he showed up at my workplace. Just walked right into the law office where I worked as a paralegal and asked to speak with me privately. His message was clear. Maya, I think there's been some misunderstanding. You seem to think you have problems with your apartment, but I have copies of your lease here. You're behind on rent, you've violated several clauses, and frankly, I'm concerned about your stability. It would be a shame if I had to evict you, especially with your daughter's health issues. The threat was obvious. Stop complaining or lose your home. And for most tenants, that would have been the end of it. But Marcus had made one crucial mistake. He had just threatened a paralegal who specialized in housing law. A woman who had spent 3 years studying tenant rights, discrimination cases, and landlord-tenant disputes. A woman who knew exactly what illegal intimidation looked like. That night, Sophia had another asthma attack. As I held her in the emergency room for the 4th time that month, watching her struggle to breathe because of the mold in her home, something inside me snapped. I realized I had to choose between keeping quiet to protect our housing and fighting back to protect my daughter's health. And that's when I decided Marcus Wellington had picked the wrong tenant to mess with. What I discovered next changed everything. Marcus Wellington wasn't just a slumlord. He was running a full-scale criminal operation with protection from the top. I started digging into public records during my lunch breaks, and what I found made my blood run cold. Marcus owned 47 properties across the city, all operating under the same predatory model. Fake luxury listings, bait-and-switch tactics, and systematic abuse of vulnerable tenants. But here's the part that really got me. He had the city inspector on payroll. I found records showing that James Morrison, the head of Housing Inspection Services, had been rubber-stamping safety certificates for buildings that were literally falling apart. The same inspector who had cleared our building while mold was eating through the walls. Morrison's signature was on dozens of fraudulent reports, and in return, Marcus was funneling money to him through fake consulting contracts. I need to know something. Have you ever had that moment where you realized you had to stop being the victim and become the person who fights back? Because that's exactly what happened to me in that law office basement, surrounded by files that proved Marcus was destroying hundreds of families. I worked nights and weekends, documenting everything: moldy walls, sparking outlets, illegal partitions. This case wasn't just my mission, it was survival. I learned that Marcus was charging full rent for apartments that were supposed to be condemned. I discovered he was advertising one-bedroom units that were actually studios illegally converted with thin walls that didn't reach the ceiling. But I wasn't working alone anymore. I reached out to tenants in Marcus's other buildings, and what I found was a network of families just like mine, scared, isolated, and being systematically abused. There was Carmen, a nurse who was paying rent for an apartment where the bathroom ceiling had collapsed. There was David, a veteran whose luxury apartment had no working heat in the middle of winter. There was elderly Mrs. Chin, who was being charged late fees for rent she paid on time because Marcus would deliberately lose her money orders. The more I talked to these families, the more I realized Marcus had created a perfect system of fear. He'd isolate each tenant, make them think they were the only ones with problems, and threaten eviction if they complained. But when we started comparing notes, we realized we had power in numbers. Marcus must have sensed what was happening because his intimidation tactics got more desperate. He started showing up at our building unannounced, claiming he was doing random inspections, but really just trying to catch us organizing. He'd enter our apartments without notice, which is completely illegal, and leave threatening notes about lease violations. He even had his property manager call Sophia's school, claiming I was an unstable tenant who might be evicted soon. But Marcus had made a fatal mistake. He was escalating against someone who understood the law better than he did. Every illegal entry, every false threat, every intimidation tactic was just more evidence for the case I was building. I started recording our conversations, documenting every interaction, building a timeline that showed a clear pattern of harassment and discrimination. Then I found the smoking gun. While reviewing Marcus's tax records, I discovered he was claiming massive losses on properties that were actually profitable. He was reporting units as vacant when they were occupied, claiming repair expenses that never happened, and even collecting insurance money for damage he never fixed. This wasn't just about being a bad landlord. Marcus was committing tax fraud, insurance fraud, and probably money laundering. But the real breakthrough came when I realized Marcus wasn't just targeting random vulnerable people. He was specifically targeting single mothers, immigrants, and people with past evictions because he knew we'd be less likely to fight back. This wasn't just negligence, it was systematic discrimination, which is a federal crime. That's when I knew I wasn't just fighting for better living conditions anymore. I was fighting to take down a criminal enterprise that was destroying families across the entire city. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like I had the weapons to win. Here's what Marcus Wellington never bothered to find out about me. Before Sophia was born, before my ex-husband destroyed our finances and disappeared, before I became just another struggling single mother he could exploit, I was Maya Rodriguez, senior paralegal at Henderson and Associates, the city's most prestigious civil rights law firm. For 8 years, I specialized in housing discrimination cases. I had helped win over $2 million in settlements against slumlords just like Marcus. I knew every trick in the book because I had seen them all before. The fake inspection certificates, the discriminatory tenant screening, the illegal lease clauses. I had built cases around these exact tactics. Marcus thought he was dealing with a desperate woman who would take whatever scraps he threw her way. He had no idea he was dealing with someone who had made a career out of destroying men like him. The moment everything clicked was when I found Marcus's inspection certificates in the building records. I recognized the forged signature immediately. I had seen James Morrison's real signature on dozens of legitimate documents during my years at the firm. The certificate for our building was a complete fake, and I knew exactly how to prove it. Marcus hadn't just been bribing the inspector. He had been forging official documents when the inspector wouldn't play along. I literally got chills. Marcus had no idea who he was messing with. Sometimes, the underestimated become unstoppable. That's when I realized the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just about one corrupt landlord and one dirty inspector. Marcus's operation was connected to a network of corruption that reached into City Hall, the Housing Authority, and even the police department. I recognized the pattern from cases I had worked on years ago. When you find one fake document, you dig deeper and you usually find a whole system of fraud. I started cross-referencing Marcus's properties with city records, and what I found was staggering. Dozens of buildings with forged safety certificates. Zoning violations that had been mysteriously overlooked. Building permits that had been fast-tracked through the system. Marcus wasn't just breaking the law. He was operating with protection from multiple city departments. But here's the thing about corruption, it leaves paper trails. And I knew exactly where to look. I spent weeks pulling public records, filing information requests, and piecing together a network of fraudulent documents that stretched back 5 years. Every forged certificate, every bribed official, every illegal payoff. I documented it all. The other tenants started to see me differently. Word spread through our building and Marcus's other properties that there was someone who actually knew how to fight back. Carmen, the nurse, started bringing me documents from her building. David, the veteran, introduced me to tenants from 3 other Marcus properties. Mrs. Chin connected me with her nephew, who worked in the city clerk's office and could verify which documents were legitimate. For the first time in 2 years, these families had hope. They saw that Marcus wasn't invincible, that his threats weren't backed by real power, and that someone finally understood how to use the system against him. I went from being just another victim to being the person they looked to for leadership. And Marcus? Marcus was starting to panic. He could sense that something had changed, that his usual intimidation tactics weren't working anymore. When he showed up at our building for another random inspection, I was waiting for him with a folder full of documentation. I looked him in the eye and said, "Marcus, I know about the forged certificates. I know about the bribes. I know about the tax fraud. And I know exactly what laws you've broken." For the first time since I'd known him, Marcus Wellington looked scared. He realized he wasn't dealing with a desperate tenant anymore. He was dealing with someone who had the knowledge and the evidence to destroy everything he had built. The hunter had become the hunted, and he knew it. That's when I told him the truth. I'm not just a paralegal, Marcus. I'm a paralegal who spent 8 years specializing in housing discrimination cases. I've taken down landlords who were smarter than you, richer than you, and better connected than you. And now I'm going to take you down too. The look on his face was priceless. This man who had spent years terrorizing vulnerable families suddenly realized he had picked the wrong person to mess with. I wasn't just fighting for my daughter's health anymore. I was fighting to bring down an entire criminal enterprise. And for the first time in this whole nightmare, I knew I was going to win. The morning of March 15th, I woke up at 5 a.m. and made the call that would change everything. This is Maya Rodriguez. It's time. Within minutes, 3 years of meticulous planning erupted into coordinated chaos across the entire city. At 6 a.m. sharp, federal agents were breaking down the doors of Marcus's penthouse while simultaneously raiding his downtown office, his warehouse storage facility, and all 12 of his properties. I had given them a roadmap to every piece of evidence, every hidden document, every bribed official. They found fake inspection certificates stuffed in his bedroom safe, bank records showing payments to city councilmen hidden in his office walls, and hard drives full of tenant blackmail material locked in his basement. But here's the beautiful part. While Marcus was being dragged out of his penthouse in his silk pajamas, I was standing in front of Channel 7 News with a 3-inch binder of evidence. I looked directly into that camera and said, "My name is Maya Rodriguez, and I'm here to tell you how your city government has been selling you out to slumlords for years." The reporter asked me how I felt seeing Marcus finally arrested. I told her the truth. That watching him get exactly what he deserved was the most satisfying moment of my life. Have you ever witnessed someone get the karma they deserved? Because this moment hits different when you know how much suffering he caused. By noon, the story had exploded across every news outlet in the state. Single mother exposes housing corruption network. Paralegal brings down slumlord empire. Federal raids target City Hall. I was getting calls from reporters, housing advocates, and other victims who had been too scared to speak up before. Marcus's powerful friends abandoned him faster than rats fleeing a sinking ship. The mayor who had been taking his donations suddenly claimed he barely knew the man. The city council members who had been rubber-stamping his violations were lawyering up and pointing fingers at each other. The housing inspector who had been taking bribes was already cutting a deal with the FBI. But the moment that meant everything to me was when I walked into our new apartment, a real apartment with working heat and no mold, and watched my daughter Sophia take her first deep breath in 3 years without wheezing. She looked at me and said, "Mama, did you really make the bad man go away?" I told her yes, and that sometimes when people try to hurt you, you have to be brave enough to fight back. The federal charges came down like an avalanche. Marcus was hit with housing discrimination, wire fraud, tax evasion, racketeering, and conspiracy. 18 federal counts in total, each one carrying serious prison time. His assets were frozen immediately. The penthouse, the cars, the offshore accounts, even his precious art collection. Everything he had built on the backs of families like mine was gone. The city officials who had been protecting him weren't spared either. The housing inspector got 5 years for bribery. 2 city council members were indicted for conspiracy and corruption. Even the mayor was facing federal investigation for his role in the cover-up. At the press conference, I stood at that podium and looked out at all those cameras. I thought about every family Marcus had destroyed, every child who had gotten sick from his moldy apartments, every mother who had been too scared to fight back. I said, this isn't just about one corrupt landlord. This is about a system that was designed to protect the powerful and crush the vulnerable. But today, the vulnerable fought back and won. The community response was incredible. Tenants who had been living in fear for years were finally coming forward with their stories. Other cities were launching investigations into their own housing corruption. Housing advocacy groups were using my case as a blueprint for taking on slumlords nationwide. But honestly, do you think I went too far? Or was this exactly what Marcus had coming? Because watching him lose everything he had stolen from families like mine, I'm not gonna lie, it felt like justice finally working the way it's supposed to. 3 years later, I'm standing in what used to be Marcus Wellington's penthouse. It's been converted into the headquarters of the Rodriguez Housing Justice Center, a nonprofit I founded to help other families fight back against slumlords. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm now working from the same building where he used to count his blood money. Marcus got 18 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay back over $15 million in damages. His empire is gone, his reputation destroyed, and his former friends won't even take his calls from prison. But honestly, his downfall was just the beginning. The legislative changes that came from our case have been incredible. The city passed the strongest tenant protection laws in the country. Landlords now face mandatory inspections, heavy fines for violations, and automatic compensation for displaced tenants. They created a tenant rights hotline and funded free legal aid for housing cases. What started as one woman's fight for justice became a blueprint for housing reform across the nation. Isabella is now 10 years old, and she's never had another asthma attack. She lives in a beautiful apartment with working heat, no mold, and a landlord who actually follows the law. Sometimes I catch her telling her friends about how her mom fought the bad man and won. That pride in her voice, that's worth more than any victory I could have achieved. But the real impact has been watching other victims find their courage. Maria from apartment 3B now runs tenant workshops in Spanish. James from the building next door became a housing inspector to make sure no one else gets away with what Marcus did. Mrs. Chin started a support group for families dealing with housing discrimination. The ripple effect of one person's refusal to stay quiet has created an entire movement. I've spoken at housing rights conferences in 12 states, sharing the strategies that brought down Marcus's empire. Former tenants who were too scared to speak up before are now leading their own advocacy groups. The properties Marcus used to own have been converted into genuinely affordable housing with tenant protections built right into the leases. Last month, I got a call from a single mother in Detroit whose landlord was pulling the same scams Marcus used to run. She said my story gave her the courage to fight back, and she wanted to know how to document her case. I walked her through every step, just like someone should have done for me years ago. That's what this is all about, making sure no one has to face these predators alone. The housing crisis is still real, and there are still corrupt landlords out there exploiting vulnerable families. But now there's a network of people who know how to fight back, and a legal framework that actually protects tenants instead of just property owners. Do you believe one person can really change the system? Because I used to think it was impossible. I used to think people like Marcus were too powerful, too connected, too rich to ever face consequences. But here's what I learned. The system only works for bullies when good people stay silent. The moment you decide to document every violation, to know your rights, to refuse to be intimidated, that's when the power shifts. If you're dealing with a corrupt landlord, know your rights. Document everything. Don't suffer in silence. And remember, sometimes the person they underestimate the most is the one who brings their whole world crashing down. What injustice around you demands a voice? Drop it in the comments, because silence protects the powerful, but your voice could spark a revolution.